In October last year, China launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. Since then, 57 countries have signed up, and the bank will have an initial subscribed capital of $50 billion. Now, the AIIB includes well over a quarter of the world's nations. Interestingly, 16 of the world's 20 largest economies are on board that bank. But the US, Japan, Mexico and Canada are the few countries that have not yet signed up. Can the AIIB emerge as a rival to the World Bank? Well, to discuss the economic and political implications of this new emerging bank, I'm joined by Raj Desai, Associate Professor of International Development at Georgetown University. Professor Desai, thank you very much for your time. We have the World Bank, we have the Asian Development Bank. About a year ago, we heard of a BRICS bank, and now here's this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that seems to be fast winning fans across the world. What do you expect the AIIB will evolve into?
Thank you very much for being. It's a pleasure to be with you. The AIIB is actually part of a series of institutions that are essentially attempting to bypass what we call the Bretton Woods institutions of the World Bank and the IMF, to provide alternative mechanisms for funding needs in developing countries. Now, unlike the BRICS Bank, as you mentioned previously, which has equally divided shares and countries that really have nothing in common except that they have expressed dissatisfaction with the way the World Bank works, the AIIB is something very different. The AIIB has the power to rival and in fact exceed the capacity of the main institutions that the main multilateral institutions that fund infrastructure in Asia, by which I'm referring to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The AIIB will potentially dwarf both of these institutions if the authorized capital requirements are met and if more and more members begin to join. So unlike the BRICS Bank, which may have some coordination difficulties, the AIIB is much less likely to have those difficulties. It also has a far more focused mission than the BRICS Bank.
Okay, I want to discuss both the economic implications of what this bank can do, and then we'll talk a little bit about the politics of the situation and the opposition we've seen in the U.S. But yes, first up, we've seen outside of all the Asian countries, China leading this effort, India part of it, I'm told Russia has signed up as well. We've seen a clutch of Western European countries jump to be part of this bank. Is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank going to invest in infrastructure or fund infrastructure across the world? Will it mostly look at infrastructure needs of Asian countries? I understand these are early days as yet for the bank, but what is the sense that you get that the AIIB's purpose will be?
Well, right now the AIIB's focus is obviously Asia. There's certainly a possibility that with additional subscribed capital that it could focus on infrastructure, but I think for the foreseeable future, the focus is going to be Asia, where the demands for infrastructure investment are quite significant. In fact, the estimates are anywhere from $8 to $10 trillion in investment over the next decade is needed in infrastructure in Asia. And in fact, the government of India has estimated that $1 trillion of that is going to be the case for India itself. Now, the Western European countries are getting involved because they recognize that they actually stand potentially to benefit from participating in an organization that can lend to some of the fastest growing economies on the planet and provide opportunities through public-private partnerships, through other forms of private participation in infrastructure investment to investors from their own countries, from Germany, France, the UK, etc. So it's not surprising to me to see that there has been a kind of bandwagon effect, first of Asian countries obviously all joining, and now Western European powers, and potentially countries like Australia, South Korea, and so on.
You emphasized on the size or the kind of capital that the AIIB will bring to the table. $50 billion is what we understand the size of the initial capital of the bank will be. Is that the only big difference between what the AIIB seeks to achieve as opposed to what the World Bank and the ADB have sought to achieve, let's say in emerging markets like India or in Asian countries like India and China? Or do you see the AIIB bringing a sort of local focus, a local understanding? What will those goals be? How will it differentiate itself from what the World Bank has done or the ADB has done in the past?
So that's a bit of a double-edged sword because the United States, for example, is cautious and has been cautious about the AIIB because of the fear that it will not apply the standards of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank with respect to environmental safety or labor standards. So there is a possibility that at least a Chinese-led bank or an Asian-led bank will apply a much different focus in terms of infrastructure investment. On the other hand, it seems to me that it is in China's interest, as well as in the interest of all of the recipient countries in the Asian continent, to ensure that some of the standards and best practices of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank are applied with the AIIB's practices. Now, the other issue, of course, is that the AIIB is going to be, from what we know, exclusively focused on infrastructure investment, whereas the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, which have a combined capital base of about $400 billion, their mandate is, of course, all aspects of poverty reduction. So it covers a lot more than infrastructure. And in fact, if you use the same capital to lending ratios of the World Bank and the ADB, then the AIIB, if it reaches its authorized capital amount, could lend for infrastructure amounts that actually dwarf that of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank.
So for a country like India, this could be a game changer. This could be a bank that steps in to fund the big infrastructure deficit that India is facing currently.
Absolutely. The deficit that India is facing is a deficit that many Asian countries are facing. India, of course, because it is such a large economy with such diverse and extensive infrastructure needs, the infrastructure gap is significant. As I mentioned earlier, the estimates are 8 to 10 trillion over 10 years. A very small portion of that is being financed by the current multilateral development banks, and an even smaller portion by private investors. So there is a significant infrastructure gap that needs to be plugged.
All right, I do want to mention the politics of the situation because I understand it's now become the battle of banks. The U.S. has been very opposed to the coming together of these so many countries, including some of its allies, for instance, Saudi Arabia or its friends in Europe, to back this China-led effort of AIIB. Do you see the AIIB displacing the World Bank? Do you see the U.S. coming to terms with the AIIB? Do you see that, all the unfair terms that Asian countries have seemed to face at the IMF or the World Bank, in a sense, get balanced out by the creation of their very own bank?
Absolutely. And in fact, you could argue that one of the reasons that we have seen this, the development of these institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Bank or the BRICS Bank, one of the reasons has been the U.S. unwillingness to move on quota reform at the IMF. So the IMF there's a proposal, obviously, to double the resources that would be available, and it has been stuck in Congress, the American Congress, since 2010. In addition, the U.S. is really not in any mood to appropriate $2 billion or whatever to participate in this organization. And I think that, in fact, there has been I've made this publicly, that I think the U.S. has been mistaken in avoiding or in rebuking its allies from joining an institution that it cannot and does not want to participate in. This is something that could end up shooting the U.S. in the foot, in the sense that American investors, American private companies, may end up losing out in the booming, what hopefully will be a booming Asian infrastructure market. So I think the U.S. has been a little bit reactionary when it comes to dealing with this institution. Now, of course, that has, in some sense, that has been an American tradition, which is that we oppose alternatives to the institutions that we have a major stake in, mainly the Bretton Woods institutions. After the Asian crisis in the late 90s, there was a Japanese proposal to create, for example, an Asian monetary fund, which was more or less quashed by the U.S. Treasury at the time. Things have changed in the last 20 years. The U.S.'s authority, the U.S.'s power in the world in relative terms is somewhat diminished relative to rising Asian powers. And rather than fight this and rebuke its allies for joining, it would seem to me to be a much better path to welcome this type of institution, to welcome the competition in development financing around the world. It would be better not just for Asia, but for the U.S. as well.
Well, we'll see if that political stance changes. Professor Desai, thank you very much for joining us this evening here in India and talking us through what the AIIB could mean for countries like India.